Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, like the video, and if you enjoyed the story, leave a comment on if you would want more. This fan fiction was not created by me, but in the description there is a link to the fanfic so you can show your support to the creator and read along. Without any more delay, let's dive into the story.
Every morning, or every other morning when he'd choose to pass the test to go on die fighting Orochimaru, or laugh himself sick as Gaara gelded Sasuke, Naruto woke up to the same old broken-down dive he'd always lived in. Although, ever since he'd begun his home improvement kick, he'd wake up to create a steadily increasing number of clones to work on the place while he was away. Lately he'd been creating close to 600 clones every morning just to fix up his house. They'd strip out everything except the support beams for the upper stories, then go to work. By the time he came back for lunch, if he came back for lunch, variety was the spice of life. After all, his apartment would cover 2 entire floors of that building that were formerly empty. No one wanted to live too close to the demon brat, with open internal balconies, galleries, brand new custom furniture and floorings, everything clean and bright, newly painted and with glittering fixtures. The entire place was a palace. Of course, the Uchiha district was simply enormous, large enough to practically count as a village unto itself, with its own shops and everything. But now it all sat empty. It would be a mistake to say that Naruto bought it. Actually, the Hokage gave it to him for free, reasoning to the boy in private that he could not make up for his harsh life in other ways, but perhaps this could go a long way toward giving him a brighter future. In public he had no need to say anything but that those lands were his to distribute as he chose, and no one else had wanted them in all the years they'd been available. So, like the first Hokage had done, the third made them a grant, as he had the authority to do. And, since he'd learned how to get the Hokage to do that for him, Naruto did it often, because after every reset it was back to that same old dingy dive he'd always called home. Interestingly enough, having done a little research, he knew what was now the Forest of Death had once been offered as the same deal to another clan, one that had not, in the end, elected to join the newly emerging village of Konoha, but had stayed in the Land of Mist where their valuable abilities had since been destroyed when that country turned against and murdered their bloodline-carrying clans. The land, initially kept reserved in case they'd changed their minds, had since come to other uses as a survival training ground and testing area. But all of that came about later as he was doing research into the district and discussing the history of the place with Sarutobi. Ever since he'd started getting it, he would spend some time there searching as he poked further and further into the former Uchiha lands. For the moment, he was busy looking for their library of stolen ninja techniques. It was not easy to find. Hardly surprising, really. The Hokage had doubtless been searching himself, and sent teams to do likewise before they'd closed it all down. The collection of scrolls on stolen techniques must represent an incredible resource, if only no one could find it, and Sasuke wasn't talking. Perhaps the bastard realized what he'd given up, and had been trying to figure out a way to get it back, after having spent part of the money. Nah. That was really unlikely. Anything Sasuke wanted, he got, as someone was willing to give it to him. No, more than likely he was just being a bastard about it, denying the village help because he could. It was also possible the bastard had forgotten where it was. After all, he'd been quite young when he'd left the place, and that might have gotten caught up in all of the general repressing he did over the rest of that trauma. Sasuke was not a well-adjusted, happy boy. It was also possible the broody boy had never known about it. Children blab things without meaning to. So, if it was all so desperately secret, they just might not have told the kid where it was before they all died, just handing him scrolls as needed. And if that were the case, the Uchiha was too proud to ever admit it. Anyway, no longer dipping into the Uchiha's mind, it was an icky place. The Uzumaki boy had spent several entire resets after finding out how to get the Hokage to grant him those properties, going over them and looking for those scrolls, only to be disappointed. They were really marvelously well hidden. But then he had an idea. It struck him, as he'd been thinking, that somewhere on the Uchiha property was the Uchiha library, containing whatever records they'd made of special moves and ninja powers stolen over entire generations of using Sharingan, that it was presently hidden in such a way that unless he could somehow get his own Sharingan, the most likely key, he was unlikely to find it. Ever, considering how hard he'd looked already. His clones were in the process of dismantling buildings, and if they hadn't found it by doing that, they were not likely to find it at all. Although there were plenty of ordinary secrets around the place. Who knew that the Uchiha were such perverts? There was porn stuck in practically every wall of every home, concealed by who knows who for what reasons. Although, he was learning a great deal about traps as he dismantled the places, and the Uchiha had some fiendish ones. Too bad most couldn't be used out in field conditions. Still, that wasn't a total loss, as it had reminded him of something. Namely, Sasuke's techniques hadn't come out of nowhere. He'd known some C-rank special powers even before he'd graduated the Ninja Academy, which was also long before he'd gotten his Sharingan activated. So, no Sharingan meant he couldn't have just copied them, which meant that he'd learned them from somewhere. Since it was unlikely his family taught him, seeing as how they were all dead, and had been long before the Uchiha had started to use those techniques, the most likely answer was he'd learned them off scrolls, perhaps taken from that exact same Uchiha library. So, what would an arrogant bastard do with a scroll detailing a secret ninja power after he'd learned what it could show him? Why, nothing. He'd leave it wherever it happened to be when he got finished with it. Because, you see, arrogance makes people do things like that. And especially in the Uchiha's case, where people were falling over themselves in eagerness to do things for him or give things to him, he didn't have to be careful with anything that he had. There is a word for that, and it is called spoiled, a word that suited Sasuke perfectly. He was a perfect little spoiled princess. Everyone in Konoha loved him and gave him whatever he wanted, while he pouted about it not being enough or good enough for him. So, figuring that unless Sasuke gave it away once he no longer had need of it, and not finding that likely, as the Uchiha was far from generous, Naruto felt that the most probable place for those scrolls to be abandoned was in the bastard's apartment. So he broke in to go looking for it, one day while a clone was off taking the written test to cover for him, so he could be certain Sasuke wasn't home, or going to be returning there for an hour or more. That was all the time the blonde burglar would need to ransack the residence of his rival, especially with a dozen clones to help. He could go over every inch of it to be sure not to miss anything. They struck pay dirt almost at once. It wasn't even hard. On a shelf next to the dining room table was one of those little honeycomb hold organizers meant for holding scrolls. Most of them were slightly dusty, and seeing as how Naruto knew his teammate had a cleaning lady that was sad, as it said he almost never read them. Which suited what he'd expected, actually. A couple of those scrolls were worn, like they had been well read. Taking one down to look at it, the blonde burglar found on it the basics of how to use the Sharingan, for those that had the bloodline, what to expect from activation and so on, including cautions on its use, mostly a warning to beware of the level of chakra drain. Nothing terribly hard to understand, although it did contain some specifics that outsiders to the clan would probably find useful, such as limited range, included as part of a caution that anything not clearly seen could not be adequately predicted or copied. So it wasn't telescopic vision. That was good to know. If a normal person could not see it in sufficient detail to read, the Sharingan couldn't copy it. If that sort of information was widespread, then everyone facing one of this clan would do Zabuza's thing of hiding out in mist or fog to hunt these guys. Oh well, nothing there he didn't already know. But it was nice to see it spelled out in detail. Two more of those scrolls showed the basics of a fighting style, developed by the Uchiha after a generation of stealing the best they could see. On the few scrolls he had available, it wasn't much, not too different from the style taught at the academy, but it did show a few moves Sasuke had used that were not taught to ordinary ninja. It probably got into greater detail on more advanced scrolls, but those were not present, only the basics, probably what Sasuke had been working on at the time the clan died. The last of the frequently read scrolls was solid gold, as far as Naruto was concerned. It contained several fire techniques, the two that he'd seen his rival use, plus 4 others. The later ones on the scroll hadn't been read as much as the first 2, while the last had hardly been read at all. Naruto palmed his face and sighed. Somehow he'd always figured as much. Deep down, the bastard was just as lazy as Kakashi. Once something got hard, he'd stop even trying. Maybe having the Sharingan made you stupid? Unable to read? But no, that couldn't be right. To get the early parts of this scroll so worn, his rival would have had to have been studying this for years. Yet, he hadn't mastered the whole thing? Naruto didn't know about anyone else, but he would have been using all 6 of those special moves in a month, tops. And that was even before he really knew how to read. Most likely he would have blitzed through them in less than a week, frying himself several times in the process of learning them, but still. To have had such wealth and not devoured it was inconceivable to the orange-clad boy, whose appetite for ninja skills was insatiable. And that fire scroll was just one of many. The next scroll Naruto pulled down from that shelf was a new addition by the look of it, yet still several months old. But when he opened it up it explained itself, because at the top was a note from Kakashi, saying that these might help the Uchiha to become a better ninja. On it were 3 earth techniques, one for making a wall of earth spring up out of the ground to protect you from opponents, and the 2 Kakashi had used to defeat Sasuke during the Genin test, one that allowed a user to hide underground, even moving a short distance through dirt, and the other where you dragged your victim down into the earth until only their head stuck out. By the looks of it, their teacher had to have given this to Sasuke right after the test, or at least in that time frame, yet it was brand new, it had never been opened, much less read. Naruto stood there, fists clenched and steamed. How could he? How could Sasuke be so wasteful? And Kakashi? He'd never once offered to train his most desperate student in anything useful. The blonde had begged and pleaded for scraps of attention, for any hint of training, and yet here he'd showered it on the pretty head of the Uchiha. Even when he didn't want. In the midst of this upset, a light bulb went off over Naruto's head. This had been the way it had always been between them. Kakashi would ignore him to favor Sasuke, while Sasuke didn't work hard or appreciate. That was it. The one time Kakashi had done anything close to training anyone other than Sasuke was that tree climbing exercise. Sakura had gotten it right away, while Naruto had pressed hard, and the Uchiha only worked at it because he didn't want Naruto to get the move down first. Kakashi was using him as a tool to motivate the Uchiha who, by the looks of the things found here in his room, didn't work hard for anything if he could avoid it. So why hadn't he done those contests more times? Faye. Probably because Sasuke asked him not to. Kakashi would never do anything Sasuke didn't want. He loved him like a son and wouldn't deny him anything, including having his rival held back, and Sasuke practically defined his existence by being better than Naruto. No, not just better, by utterly leaving him in the dust. The greater the gap between their abilities, the more the Uchiha would gloat and boast over it. So that's why Kakashi hadn't done any more of those race-you to learn this contests between him and the Uchiha, even though it did serve to motivate the broody bastard. After all, whenever Kakashi made the 2 race to get a technique down, they'd both still learn it eventually. And Sasuke felt better about himself when Naruto knew nothing. It gave him a better opportunity to shine, after all. The bastards. Grabbing all of those scrolls so he could memorize them over the rest of the day, and who cared if the Uchiha found them missing? They'd all be back in place after the reset anyway, and the Uchiha would recall nothing of it. Naruto almost missed one that had been tossed into the back like garbage. Peeking at it, Naruto found it to be a scroll of very minor ninja techniques useful in camping. But scribbled across the top, in Sasuke's handwriting back from 3rd grade or so, was "not going to help me beat Itachi." So, that made it garbage, did it? Naruto didn't think so, and he grabbed that scroll along with the others to go and study their contents. Unlike certain Uchihas, he wasn't going to turn up his nose at any chance to increase his skills or knowledge. It disgusted him that anyone could call that sort of pathetic person a genius. On his way out, his clone stopped him to see a discovery they'd made while prying up floorboards. Hey! It didn't matter if they got caught ransacking the place, as it would all be back to normal either tomorrow or the next day. Down in a dusty corner, hidden under the floor, was a box of what had to be Sasuke's treasures. It held an ornate katana, a lady's jeweled pin, and a small box of family photos. Since some of those photos showed his dad with the sword, and his mom wearing the pin, the photos had names on the backs, it was easy to figure out these were all relics of his parents. Holes had been cut out of some of those photos, where, at a guess, Itachi had once been pictured. A name scribbled out here or there confirmed it. These treasures weren't exactly hidden in a convenient place, but neither were they left entirely alone. The nails and holes over the opening in the floor to reach them showed signs of having been pried open several times before. So, at a guess, the last Uchiha pried them up to look at his family mementos once or twice a year, or whenever his brooding began to falter. Acting on a bit of petty revenge, Naruto took the items to see how much a pawn shop would offer for them. Of course, armed with the Uchiha's bank account information, found hidden behind a painting in the sweets kitchen, he had no need of extra money. One quick shapeshift and cash withdrawal would provide all he could want within his modest needs, he felt sure. But it was the spirit of the thing that counted. Sasuke treated what Naruto treasured as garbage. Naruto could do the same in return. Aye. Those purloined scrolls were a treasure trove of the highest order to Naruto, who'd been desperately seeking after such knowledge for years. Even if you didn't count all of the time pre-loop he'd spend long enough during endless repeating days, he felt that probably qualified alone. Even just the scrolls he had already opened amazed him with their utility. Opening them all revealed nearly 30 techniques, only counting those that Naruto didn't already know, averaging about 6 techniques per each of the 5 common elements, and most of those scrolls had never been opened. Not once, until Naruto had done so just now. In fact, floating down out of one was a note, almost 5 years old, inviting the Uchiha to special training, written by one of their academy teachers. Naruto didn't know if the man had gotten to teach Sasuke private lessons or not, and that was far from the only scroll about techniques given to Sasuke during his academy days. There were scrolls on the basic 3 with notes and details written in the margins that the Uzumaki lad had to pull out of Ebisu a scrap at a time. Actually. Naruto scowled, reading on. Yup. Ebisu still hadn't taught him all of this stuff. There were a few ways to tweak those techniques that the special Jonin had never mentioned, like that basic clones did not have to be formed of the user himself, nor did they have to be of human or even animate creatures. The note told a story of a special case when an illusion of a deer, frightened away by an enemy's approach, had convinced a squad of ninja during one war that the victim they were seeking was not present, else he would have spooked the deer himself, when he was the one laying wounded under a bush who'd created the deer clone. And there were multiple anecdotes of enemy ninja scrambling for dropped weapons only to find, as their hands closed upon hilts, that the obvious ones they'd been seeking were simple illusions, and useless to them. Transformation and body switch had been put to similarly imaginative uses, all listed out here as suggestions for the Uchiha by generous professors. And for the most part, he'd never once even looked at the scrolls. Actually, looking at the dates, Naruto had to suppress another grimace of disgust, as these teachers had been trying to get Sasuke to learn the jutsus at least a year in advance of the other students being introduced to them. A genius? Oh. You bet. I mean, look at how fast he'd learned the whatever. Well, yeah, that was easy to do when you had a year lead-in on everyone else learning them. Sasuke would have had to have a head like a block of wood not to have gotten them quickly or early. And somehow Naruto did not suspect those teachers had given up when he hadn't read their scrolls. All of the extra credit stuff was included that Naruto had never gotten invited to learn, too. There were techniques taught as rewards to talented students to help motivate them in classes, things like how to detonate exploding tags from a short distance, basic stealth and wire work, how to form tags into defensive traps automatically triggered by an enemy crossing the circle, and more. Body flicker, yep, everything he knew except the shadow clone and his own creations had been given to the Uchiha long ago, most of them with master's suggestions on how to really use the techniques to their full potentials. And, yes, the 3 basic chakra control exercises were all here, spelled out in detail. One of them was even a gift from Kakashi. Naruto, the boy had to stifle a sigh and wipe away a tear. He would have done anything for that level of support, for even half the assistance the Uchiha had received. But then he had to stifle a miserable laugh, too, as all of that put together, and what did Sasuke use? Sasuke'd known roughly 2 techniques, outside of the basic academy ones. 2. Here on these scrolls before him were listed nearly 30. A Chunnin would have been happy to have that kind of technique arsenal. And here Sasuke could have had that as a freaking academy student. If only he'd listened to those who would have gladly taught him. It made him want to cry. All that support, and the Uchiha hadn't even wanted it. He'd certainly never come close to making the best use of it. Impotent jealousy gave Naruto actual, physical pain before he reined it in and mastered himself. Whining about the past couldn't solve his current problems. That was what the broody bastard did, and look at where it got him. He could have been a jonin by now, easily, if he hadn't been feeling sorry for himself and had actually been willing to work hard for what he wanted. Naruto did not know what Sasuke's problem was, but he sure as anything wasn't going to share it. These techniques were before him, and he was going to learn them. No! He was going to master them all. Then he'd see what else he could do with those. Naruto laughed as the ANBU chasing him ran smack dab, face first into a solid mud wall that had been disguised by a veil to look like a continuation of the normal street. Yes, it was to laugh for. Submerging himself into a puddle, one of several made by smashing a water barrel he'd learned from the mistake of the Demon Brothers, he let his pursuers pass by, then doubled back the way he'd come. Suddenly having techniques, Naruto had felt the urge to use them, and you did not get better battle-like conditions without the threat of actual death than you did by having the ANBU chase you around the village for having used a creatively shaped Earth-style wall technique to fashion an arm on the Hokage monument to have the beloved first Hokage picking his nose. An Earthflow river to reshape the second's face so he was staring at his own golden prize in gleeful fascination, and the third Hokage eating his own booger with a look of joy over the taste of it. He'd even used those above techniques to give the fourth Hokage 2 hands and sink his face palm down into them over the other Hokage's antics. No, life did not get much better than this. Water surged up out of toilets to drench Kunoichi and add them to the chase when the ANBU were not a sufficient challenge by themselves. Laughing, Naruto took off running pell-mell, chased by most of the Kunoichi from the restroom, who in turn drew the ANBU back to following after him. Soon the group had him cornered, or at least so they thought, until the boy disappeared with a soft pop and a puff of smoke. Veins bulging, they took off searching for the real one amid angry mutters about a shadow clone, and Naruto, who'd used a simple body switch to change places with one, joined the chase as just one more angry Kunoichi while they all began running after a second Naruto clone. A second later he was switching back with a copy to leave 2 of the ladies who'd once been teachers at the academy submerged up to their necks in the dirt of the road, while he left other clones to doodle on their faces and play with their hairstyles. By the time the massive chase group returned from their false hunt, those women had freakish hairstyles and were covered in scribbles down to their exposed necks, and this time Naruto was back among them, this time in disguise as Kakashi, and suggesting they all go and search the training grounds, where Naruto had previously set up multiple pie traps. Yes, life really didn't get any better than this. Aye. After outsmarting most of the village on a chase and pursuit game, Naruto was ready to try his techniques under more serious conditions. Namely, that of an actual test experience. Yes, it was time to die facing Orochimaru again. Among the many scrolls given as gifts to Sasuke that the Uchiha had never used was a treatise on the sealing arts, specifically, on how to create your own explosive tags. And, well, that was just begging to be used. Now Naruto didn't kid himself. He was nowhere near expert on any of his new skills. He hadn't even gotten all 30 of them to work yet, but it was past time for him to break loose and have a little fun. Even, yes, by drawing the snake Sannin into the amazing exploding forest of doom. Wahahaha. It all failed miserably, of course, but that was the closest he'd ever gotten to actually giving the Sannin anything close to a real workout. Besides, the army of shadow clones forming Earth-style walls to block his attacks, until he'd started to use higher-ranking techniques able to break through them, and others using fireballs and grand fireballs to roast him, or attempt to do so, actually, had been really fun to orchestrate. Orochimaru had cut loose with some real winners of his own there, too. That win thing he'd done that practically leveled all before it was nice, although even so a substantial portion of his clones had survived by simply resorting to the underground move jutsu Kakashi had used on them in their first test as rookie genin. Heck! They'd even gotten close enough to scratch one of Orochimaru's mud clones. Naruto considered that a major achievement. Of course, they'd leveled several acres of forest to do it, but still. Those exploding tags had been useful after all. He'd even pressed the guy hard enough to earn the right to be skewered on his sword. The Sannin had never even bothered to pull it out before. The genin felt honored to have earned the right to die on it, seeing as how that marked a major improvement in his threat level, to have made the Sannin resort to it. No, it was the sort of thing he wanted to repeat, after he'd had a chance to more fully refine his mastery of those jutsu, and possibly learn the rest of the contents of Sasuke's private library. After all, if he could do that much using rough and raw techniques, might he not do better once he'd gotten them more fully refined? It was the sort of thing he had to know. I. Naruto was high, walking on clouds. He had finally done it. He had learned some awesome techniques. Okay, he may still rank as a genin, but he felt more fully a Chunnin every day. Why? Well, consider. Irika was a Chunnin focused on book learning, and now Naruto was just as well educated, if he didn't have a bit of an edge on his old teacher. So, in that one way he was qualified for the new rank. His medical skills were fey. Best not to mention them. But even though his practical abilities stank, and were only somewhat above academy level, he still had some ability in that department when most of the Chunnin hopefuls he knew of did not. And there was not just his practicals to consider. Sakura had graduated the Ninja Academy with the highest test scores in their year, and the worst of the practicals, evening out almost exactly in the middle. And, well, if the Uzumaki boy could rate such a test on his medical abilities right now, he'd have similar results. The academics were all there, even if his practicals weren't. If she'd rated genin rank for that, then maybe he deserved the same on his medical abilities. Just don't ask him to fix up anybody's wounds. But that still made him a genin effective on a talent where most would rank a flat 0. On seals, he had explosive tags and storage scrolls, both exceedingly useful mainstays of that professional specialty, and more than most of his grade could achieve. That reminded him. He'd have to drop by 1010 later and see if he could teach her explosive tags. The mistress of thrown weapons could gain a useful addition to her arsenal if he could teach her that quickly, as a few kunai bearing tags mixed in among her usual barrages could add a significant punch to her already deadly style. On martial arts. Okay, Chunnin was not the grade he'd grant himself on those, being only a top rookie genin in effect. There were many among the hopefuls who were better, even if he did have throwing weapons at the same training level, while they generally had only the academy basics. That wasn't something he could push up for now, so he wasn't going to worry about not being better, as he currently couldn't help it. At least with his fast healing and general toughness he was not so much of a pushover. Sure, he could be beaten, but at least he could give a credible fight before going down. And while there were stronger among the hopefuls, there were also many weaker than he. Illusions? Well, while he didn't know many, what he used, some quite effectively. Call it another genin rank skill. However, with his new skills from having read Sasuke's unwanted scrolls, he felt quite unashamed in proclaiming his ninjutsu abilities that of a solid Chunnin. Even a fairly flexible one. The thing was, you add many of these genin level abilities together and you'd be looking at a Chunnin rank ninja, as the real genin were often pathetically specialized, having only 1 or 2 abilities at their grade, not 6 or 7. Okay, Naruto didn't have 7 yet either. Only 4 at genin grade and 2 at Chunnin. But 2 was enough to enter the grade, having earned it, and he was not about to stop acquiring specialties. There was, for example, the extremely useful and yet previously neglected art of stealth. A priceless ability for ninja, and yet somehow left out of his academy education. That. It made you wonder, why had they admitted him at all if they'd been so determined not to teach him? But still, no use crying over spilled milk. There was a remedy for that. He had access to Sasuke's scrolls whenever he wanted them, and among them were the instruction manuals for the courses he'd missed, stealth among them. Stealth specialists were highly useful to ninja villages, as those were the ones you relied on for certain things you didn't trust to other ninja. A combat specialist was useful for combating the enemy, but not so much for crossing his lines or delivering messages reliably. Also, spying came into that field, which made the youth recall what Ibiki had said at the end of countless written tests so far. Those examinations were not about seeing what kind of knowledge they'd crammed into their heads. The test questions were purposefully too hard for most to answer. No, the first test of the Chunnin exam was about their information-gathering abilities. And, well, that was another specialty that Naruto had been neglecting. Well, no more. Spying was something you just had to do sometimes, and if that was the case, he was going to be good at it. A Hokage could not afford any weaknesses. And he was closer than ever before. It was an amazing day to be alive for Naruto Uzumaki. I think we should split up, Sasuke decided. An upside-down Naruto descended from above him, suspended by wires he was holding in his hands. And I think that's a terrible idea. Look at Sakura, do you think there is any ninja in this forest who couldn't defeat her? For that matter, you aren't so hot yourself, big shot. He gave the prodigy an impudent grin before withdrawing on his wires. Naruto. Sakura scolded, but couldn't put any real feeling into it, as he was right. Just about any ninja she'd ever met could. How did you learn to work with wires? She demanded. Naruto's impudent laugh was her answer until the boy swung out of the trees to land on a branch above her, pulling a scroll out of his jacket to show it to her. Here. The string reeling technique, one of the most basic of the wire-based techniques. It's useful to tie down and restrict opponents. If you're good enough, you can even use the wires to assist in your own movement by swinging, rappelling and, once you're good enough, ascending. Kakashi used this once on Sasuke when he was a kid, and I've been learning it lately. Oh, Sakura sounded humbled by this demonstration, as she'd always based her confidence in her ninja skills on the fact that she'd always been better than Naruto. Now that wasn't seeming to be the case any longer. Naruto's grin widened. Sasuke hadn't so much as noticed the technique scroll as his own, taken from the Uchiha's apartment in a bundle of discarded newspaper left rolled up in its old dust jacket. And yes, Kakashi had once used the technique to restrain Sasuke when he was a bratty kid, to get him to listen to something. And, as something of an apology, had sent him the scroll with the technique the next day, which the bastard had, to all appearances, been too proud to read. That seemed to be a pattern between them. For Naruto, though, it had been a doorway to whole new abilities, and not inconsiderable ones at that. When Sasuke angrily declared that he couldn't find another team to prey upon with his noisy teammates hanging around, and that they might as well make camp, Naruto strung trip and warning wires all around the place where they were going to be staying. The Uchiha was busy pouting. He'd probably never forgive Naruto for having saved his life from Gaara by using an earthflow river to transform Gaara's sand to mud the instant before the desert demon was to have messily killed Konoha's pride and joy. He'd even saved Sasuke's balls, which Naruto felt he was being particularly generous in doing. No, having rescued the Uchiha, literally, from the grasp of death had earned him nothing more than increased brooding. Uchihas do not have to be rescued and Uchihas do not want to be rescued, and the Uchiha had it under control the whole time, so why did you have to interfere? Pathetic. Whatever happened to Kakashi's lecture on teamwork? Oh, right, it only applied to Naruto, who had to support the teacher's favorite no matter how much of a pain he was being. The next repeat after his discovery of those scrolls in Sasuke's apartment had Naruto teaching Gaara how to get the maximum amount of blood and pain out of one broody bastard. Now he was thinking that might be due again, sometime soon. Sakura's eyes widened in shock as Naruto sent over 100 clones over the campsite to prepare the immediate area, some digging pits or rigging falling log traps, which she could at least understand, while others concealed small paper tags all across the zone. Her jaw finally fell wide open as the genin she'd always dismissed as useless fortified the entire area with traps and things she couldn't even understand. Finally, when what she guessed was the original hopped down into a shallow yet wide pit in the center of this maze of death and raised a number of earth walls, then applied another technique that allowed one to control earth and stone to shape the whole thing into a dome, which he then crafted the outer appearance of to appear as simply another rock outcropping, of which there were many in this forest, she sidled over to Sasuke where he was brooding. Sasuke, she whispered, terrified. I think this might not be our Naruto. He seems Aaieekk. The kunoichi had been flipped by her hair and pinned to the ground, a kunai held an inch from her eye by a grim-faced Naruto, who then immediately released her, sheathing the weapon. There. If I'd wanted you dead, you'd be dead. And I saved Sasuke earlier, which means you both owe me your lives. Now shut up and let me work. If you knew anything about me, you'd know that I have enemies who want me dead. This is a perfect opportunity for them, and I don't trust them to waste it. So get inside, the shelter's built. You'll be safe in there, at least I think so. Nah. Naruto doesn't know any earth jutsu. Sakura backed away from him, trembling. Naruto rolled his eyes. Okay, he'd failed that act like myself role pretty badly, but his attention was hardly on them, anyway. They were hardly the issue. No, he could tell something major was going to come stalking them soon, and in this forest at this time something major meant Orochimaru. That meant he had to get the prey victims inside and under cover soon. Yes, I do. And you know why? Because I know how to read. He slapped her in the face with the scroll on earth techniques, and while she was fumbling with that, grabbed her arm and force marched her into the hidden entrance of the concealed stone pillbox he'd constructed, 2 more clones bringing in the wire-bound Uchiha seconds later. The entrance sealed with a resounding boom, felt by all inside, leaving them in total blackness, which got illuminated a moment later by a ball of white something held in Naruto's upraised hand. A camping jutsu, a very minor lightning technique, one used to provide light to read by so ninja could read notes or maps or things. I found it in a scroll I got from Hinata. He lied to Sakura before she could suspect him further. The kunoichi nodded, still terrified and unconvinced. Nah. Naruto, what does Kakashi say is most important? She tested him. Teamwork, but then he goes and shows that he doesn't believe what he says by leaving us all to wait for him while he wastes hours each morning, an action which says he's got no respect or liking for us. Already a couple of clones had taken stacks of wood and laid a campfire, which another Naruto lit by snapping his fingers to create a flame on the end of one, which he then applied to the wood. Another camping technique, the original explained. Here is the scroll they're on. He tossed that to her casually. It got some really useful ones, the one to read by you already saw, and the one for lighting campfires and the like. There's also one for condensing water out of the air to fill your canteen, one using wind to erase tracks behind you, another wind one for dispersing smoke or disguising scents. Then you have an earth technique for softening the ground to make a pad to sleep on, which you can then reverse in the morning to eliminate traces of your camp, another earth technique for eliminating body wastes, dispersing them through a wide area of ground so they can't be used to track you, either. The boy gave a careless shrug. They're all very minor, but make life out in the wild safer and more comfortable. Though, if you were going to learn one, I'd pick the water one that lets you clean clothes or dishes, or give yourself a bath if you don't mind a harsh scrub by cold water. If we are out here a couple of days, you'll need it. There came a resounding boom from outside that was not caused by any of Naruto's copies, and he looked out toward the walls. But I don't think we'll have the time. If that's who I think it is, then we're all going to die. A giant snake came crashing down on Naruto's little hidden shelter with the force of a freight train, which the snake resembled as far as size was concerned. Orochimaru had noted the extensive trap network and been amused. It showed some ingenuity, and from what his spy Kabuto had told him, it was the Uchiha who was the only real performer on this team. So, the Uchiha had fortified this whole area? Interesting. But of no concern to the Sannin, and while he could have darted through the network untouched, it was just more fun to knock on their door, so to speak, with a large snake to set the tone for this whole encounter. The Genin team came running out in disorder as their dome collapsed, and the orange one formed a seal, creating 100 clones. Also interesting. Well, best to get on with the test. He had to see if his chosen new body was worth his time to occupy. Misty Shroud Technique. Naruto cried out loudly, forming the seals before the area got blanketed by a dense and heavy fog. Okay, he could be overheard instructing his teammates. Just don't leave the mist and he'll have trouble finding us. Stick together and don't There came a crash as one of the groups fell into a prepared pit trap. Ow! Don't worry about them, the blonde's voice called out urgently. Stick to the plan. We've got to. His voice trailed off in fear as Orochimaru came looming out of the mist before them. Cuckoo, leaving so soon? The orange-clad genin drew a kunai and threw it at the Sannin, but it was off target. Orochimaru caught the weapon in his amazingly long tongue before it had a chance to harmlessly pass him by. Aye. The real Team 7 was racing along an underground tunnel at a full sprinting velocity, 2 clones carrying each member, while both Sasuke and Sakura were tied up in wires so they couldn't struggle around too much. They'd all left the rock shelter together, but the blonde had disguised them all as his copies while summoning his clones, while 3 of his clones had assumed their places and appearances to impersonate the team. Why? Because escape tunnels from the underground shelter were too obvious. He'd tried those before, and they never worked, not even when he had a dozen of them. But no, dig them from one of those pit traps, then fall in cursing loudly. Where are you taking us? Sakura shrieked out through her gag. 10 more seconds to minimum safe distance, Naruto said, almost to himself. What? Her body arched and she shrieked. Quiet down, he hissed. Back there my clones are facing Orochi Bloody Maru. The snake Sannin. He's here to steal your broody Uchiha's eyes. Now if you want to help him by all means go on shrieking. I'll just have to cut your throat so you don't draw him down on us. Sakura went white and stilled in fear, not believing the first, but scared of the second. She didn't believe this was Naruto. He'd never talk that way to her. And that meant he could be anyone, who might do anything. No, the kunoichi went very still and quiet indeed. Naruto was shaking his head. Really, going into this, neither himself nor Sakura had the skills to take this test. He wondered what Kakashi was thinking, until he thought of Sasuke. It was probably just an attempt to elevate him as quickly as possible. The Jonin sensei of Team 7 was always pandering to the Uchiha. It probably didn't matter to him that the other two had been so out of their depth as to be almost guaranteed to die. It was an opportunity to promote Sasuke. Absently, he just went on grumbling at low volume to more fully answer her previous question. Back there my clones are doing a brilliant job of lowering his expectations before they drop everything they have on him. If only we had more time. What do you need time for? You've already got us. Sasuke whined. Because that wasn't the Misty Shroud technique. Naruto instructed him. It was actually the Mist Waltz, a move that covers an area with a flammable gas that explodes when touched by flame. And there is enough of it back there to flatten a wide area and collapse our tunnels. Aye. Orochimaru reached out with his long and flexible tongue to snag the poorly thrown weapon before it went by. Then his eyeballs crossed as the lightning electrical charge contained in the blade grounded through him, and all hell broke loose at once. Clones standing by touched wires, some producing flames, others producing lightning, all of which raced across those lines, trapping the entire camping area in a massive explosion as the huge ball of gas detonated, adding to the blasts of the hundreds of trigger techniques detonating simultaneously, and the prearranged groups of exploding tags. That section of forest vaporized in a colossal fireball while Orochimaru's nerves were still all jangled up by having the lightning jutsu stored in the kunai jolt down his tongue. The ground actually jumped and buckled under the force of that blow. But that blast only served as a prequel to the main event as thousands of clones emerged from where they had been hiding underneath the ground in a wide circle around the campsite, at a carefully calculated distance to survive the massive explosion. All across the forest, pairs of concealed Naruto clones awoke. Both snapped to attention, one transformed into an old air raid siren that he'd seen in the ancient, unplumbed depths of Konoha's museum, and the other began turning the hand crank, raising a loud and unmistakable alarm, while speaking through a microphone to call out a meaning to the alert message. Attention! Emergency! All Genin teams must evacuate the testing area immediately. An S-class missing ninja has entered the zone and begun attacking students. All Genin teams are instructed to fall back until reinforcements arrive. Considering that there were hundreds of alarm teams like this one, the alarm began blaring at huge volume across all of the forest at once. Then they began to repeat it. Orochimaru's body flickered out of the expanding fireball, hurt but not seriously injured, only to fall directly into the laps of clones who had been waiting for him, his feet sticking to the branch he'd landed on as they hit him with everything they had. A dozen different dragon flame projection streams struck him all at once, with lightning coursing in from all directions along wires and through the air. How had the kid known where he'd be? The snake Chunnin flickered twice more, each time receiving the same instant assaults upon his arrival, before he cleared the area around him with a mass, wide area technique and called Manda, the boss of the snake summons. Crowds of Naruto came charging at him, each wielding twin whips composed of solid lightning. Others charged forward above their heads, spinning wires about like mad, demented spiders, trying to catch or lead other attacks to him. While elsewhere, hundreds of Narutos standing on tree branches drew back bows and let loose a hailstorm of arrows, each being guided to track and follow their target by more wires. Multiplying himself with his own clones, Orochimaru began to counterattack. Massive explosions and cutting winds scythed through the orange wave, but always some survived and hails of thrown weapons came back in return over the heads of the jutsu-wielding close assault fighters. He raised his arms, flashing through hand seals, and the ground rose up and began churning the assault force into ruins. Then the ground turned to mud beneath his own feet just at the same time as a tremendous cutting force of wind came rushing toward him. Orochimaru flickered, placing himself at what he thought to be a safe distance from the battlefield, only to get caught on arrival by a lightning whip wrapping around his right hand and severing it. Then the tree he was on exploded, already primed with 100 explosive tags. Out of the corner of his eye, Orochimaru caught sight of Manda, his boss summon, caught up in a tornado being cut apart by winds and assaulted with a barrage of lightning sustained by close to 600 Narutos standing on the ground maintaining that arm of this assault. Actually injured, the Chunnin gave a feral grimace before shedding his skin and in the process healing all of those accumulated wounds, restoring his hand. Then he drew his sword. Clones began to die by hundreds and thousands. Before they'd been quite cut down by half, however, through the hail of kunai arrows, a blizzard web of wires and a constant barrage of all 5 elements out of all sides at once, the Chunnin heard a tremendous noise and saw an enormous tree bearing down on him, dozens of orange-clad genins perched upon its limbs as they animated the entire forest giant as one massive puppet. Then a second and a third, then a fourth forest giant strode out of the haze of explosions, all controlled by Naruto clones perched upon them. Kankuro had been very helpful, chatting about his profession, and had let his audience learn far more than he probably would have felt was wise, if he'd been aware that he'd been doing so much of it. The ground shuddered and shook as a 200-foot-tall forest giant slammed a fist down atop the snake Chunnin's head. As he reappeared on another part of that battlefield, where 2 of his mud clones had just seconds before become pincushions under the barrage of guided arrows, Orochimaru had to admit, he was actually impressed. That was before the tree he was on exploded again. Aye. All of Konoha looked up to see the tower of fiery destruction as that initial trap had gone off. Then the dark forest, black at night, lit up with flash after flash of techniques going off over a wide area. Trees began to explode, one every few seconds, lighting the night as brilliant torches. That was no genin match in there. Something was wrong, as that looked more like a full-on shinobi war. Shaken out of his bed, the Hokage rushed over to his crystal ball, and when he peered within saw the face of his orange-clad little friend battling his former student Orochimaru out in the forest. He left to lead a relief column of reinforcements at once, hundreds of Jonin and Chunnin rushing ahead or forming up behind him as the town's regular genin raced to their guard posts and aid stations. Jiraiya silently joined the group leading the counter-assault. They were not far away before the voice over the sirens began to make sense. Attention! Emergency! All genin teams must evacuate immediately. Orochimaru has entered the forest. Please fall back until reinforcements arrive. Grim-faced, the ninja flowed into the burning forest towards the center of the commotion, where a blazing giant tree puppet fell to smash, wreathed in flames, upon the earth, while another tree behind it exploded, visible even at several kilometers range, as was the twisting serpent caught in a tornado. That snake was all the confirmation anyone even vaguely informed needed. Now Grim faced himself. Jiraiya paused long enough to summon Gamabunta, his own boss summon, before racing ahead of the pack. The normally recalcitrant summon made no objections at all as it saw the scope of the destruction it had been called for. Aye. Naruto dragged himself painfully out of the mud just as the local alarm box got silenced in an awful squawk of abused and presumably destroyed equipment, almost certainly accompanied by the operator clones. Their tunnel had collapsed, but a swift underground move jutsu had saved them. It had not, however, made the save a pleasant one. The area was a scene out of hell, trees ablaze all around them. Smoke filled the air and shards of nearby explosions littered the ground while rains of burning embers drifted down to coat the broken, ash-covered surface. The air was hot and heavy, so Naruto transformed 3 of his escort clones into horses, piling his team onto their backs. Under precautionary illusions as completely unrelated Konoha ninja, they took off racing as fast as they could go toward the borders around the forest. The horses would choke to death on this smoky fog before long, but it would save his own team's lungs not to be forced to breathe it in the great gulping lungfuls they'd need if they were the ones running. As it was, they were just another anonymous genin team among hopefully scads of those escaping. They got almost half a mile out of the destruction zone before Orochimaru had finished off enough of his clones to start looking around, and saw the team racing purposefully away. They were not the only mounted ones, another team was racing away riding weasels, but they had an unusual drive and determination to make speed that caught the veteran ninja's attention. When he appeared ahead of them, however, the boy on the lead horse formed a seal and another 4,000 damnable clones appeared. What was worse was that fully half of them transformed and began running every which way. Calling up an enormous amount of chakra, Orochimaru summoned up half a dozen of his largest snakes and set them to battling the interminable horde. The area began to fog and he immediately flickered out before it all blew up in one great mushrooming fireball of explosions, only to be met by throwing weapons on wires, guided arrows, and homicidal clones flinging about dozens and hundreds of lightning, fire, earth, wind and water techniques. But the selection was poor, and knowing what they used he began to counter it far more effectively, conserving his chakra and getting less distracted. There! Out of the hordes of clones who'd transformed, fallen back, then transformed and charged again, only a few teams had kept running, but he was able to spot the ones most likely to be the real prey. It was not his first, his second, or even his third guess as to which was correct, however he did soon make a successful intercept, making sure of those others by slaughtering them all in turn. It was long past the time for playing games. Orochimaru had been getting progressively more upset, and now he was downright mad. This had all started as a simple test of the abilities of the Uchiha, and he'd yet to see the genin he'd come for throw so much as a punch. All the time it had been this orange swarm interrupting his plans, while his teammates got carried as cargo towards safety. At this point Sarutobi could not fail to be forewarned of his presence and his plans. So there was nothing left but to nab the Uchiha boy and make haste out of town, hoping that the precious Sharingan eyes were enough to offset whatever weaknesses lay in the body itself. Lunging at the orange obstacle to his plans, Orochimaru succeeded only in sinking his precious blade hilt deep in a stumpy log the boy had switched out with, not even a flicker ahead of time to warn of the technique. The boy was astonishingly good, and under better circumstances the Sannin would have felt pleased to pervert the youngster away to join his own village. But now, it was time for him to die. Aye. Naruto knew well that he had a ridiculous amount of chakra. It had been huge even before he'd begun the resets, and had only grown larger as he'd gained knowledge. Also, what he had seemed even larger yet as his control expanded to where he was not nearly so wasteful of that precious energy. Still, having fought Orochimaru before, he knew he had his limits, and the boy was coming pretty close to those now. It would not be long before the Sannin sank his sword into his chest again. But then he heard a voice that chilled his blood, crying out in fear, not for her sake, but for his own. Naruto! Almost before he was aware of it, Rock Lee with all 5 of the celestial gates he could open thrown wide smashed into the side of the Sannin and began to beat the tar out of him. Naruto's eyes got wrenched around to where they'd somehow caught up to other Konoha teams who'd been making their escape, and saw Hinata there staring at him with wide and fearful eyes. Right before Orochimaru cleared the area with another one of those devastating white area techniques. You killed Hinata. Veins bulged on Naruto's forehead and teeth grew clenched as an aura of red energy swirled up around him. Lee was still pressing the assault, mauling Orochimaru badly as the snake Sannin had underestimated the unassuming genin until the martial artist had closed to deadly ranges and not let up a second since then. Dozens of techniques got tried by the Sannin, most of which got interrupted rather rudely as the green-clad boy pounded him with enough force, from enough angles, to send him careening around like a pinball, only to get met and pounded on again by the dangerously supercharged genin. But Naruto was seeing none of it. Hinata was dead, killed by Orochimaru. He'd learned to accept, even find humor in the deaths of his own teammates, but Hinata was special. Hinata must never again be allowed to die. The boy was already in the sewer of his mind, noting that the water had drained to where they were now merely moist tunnels. But he didn't care. He raced until he stood before the fox's cage, and shouted to his prisoner, "You. Yes, you. Do you swear to destroy my enemies? To avenge Hinata's murder and chase down Orochimaru no matter where he goes or tries to hide?" "Why should I?" came the demon's mocking reply. With an angry leer of his own, Naruto leaned in close to the bars, putting his hand on the flimsy paper seal that kept that door locked. "Because if you do, then I'm pulling this off." "Yes." The demon instantly agreed. "I so swear." And then Naruto ripped off the paper seal. Outside, where Orochimaru had just finished off Lee, having barely survived the boy's mauling on top of all that had been done to him previously, the blonde boy's body rippled and swelled, changing as it grew and transformed into the nine-tailed demon fox, which roared as it finally got free. Orochimaru wet himself. Then it was as if a nuke went off in the forest of death as the demon beast unleashed its full power. I. Naruto yawned and rolled over in bed, sitting up to rub at his eyes. Well, that was one experience he wasn't of a mind to repeat anytime soon. Stomping all over Konoha after eating the third Hokage, trapped in his own mind all that time, watching as a mere passenger while the demon fox used his body. He came to a sudden halt as he entered his bathroom and noticed he had acquired a set of foxy accessories, a pair of red fox ears and a tail gently swinging out behind, while his whiskers stood out as actual stiff hairs instead of the facial lines they'd always been before. "Well, that was interesting," came a voice within his mind. "We've got to do that again sometime." "No way!" the boy suddenly shouted. "No! You were not supposed to eat my friends." "What did you expect?" the demon's voice mocked in reply. "That was never a part of our bargain. Only to destroy your enemies, not to preserve your friends. Besides, your mate was already dead anyway. You recall that part about avenging her murder? Didn't I do such an excellent job?" The demon's voice turned to laughter.
That's it for today. Remember to show your support to the creator of this story if you enjoyed it. If you would like more parts of the story to be uploaded, leave a comment and subscribe to get notified when the story continues. Bye-bye for now, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.